The quiet suburban neighborhood of Pine Grove had always been known for its peaceful Sunday afternoons, filled with the cheerful sounds of children playing and the smoky aroma of weekend barbecues. For the Chen family, who had lived there for over 15 years, their backyard gatherings were a cherished tradition that brought together not just family, but friends and neighbors who had become like family over the years. Mr. Chen, a retired firefighter with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines around his eyes, took pride in his grilling skills. His wife, a local kindergarten teacher, would spend hours preparing side dishes and desserts that blended both their Chinese heritage and American classics. Their teenage children grew up knowing Sundays meant helping to set up tables, carrying out coolers filled with drinks, and welcoming guests with warm smiles. That particular Sunday started like any other. The smell of marinated chicken and vegetables wafted through the air as smoke curled up from the grill. The Chen children helped their mother arrange potato salad, coleslaw, and fresh fruit on the outdoor tables while their father tended to the grill, wearing his favorite King of Barbecue apron, a Father's Day gift from years ago. But this peaceful scene was about to be disrupted by their newest neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, who had moved in just 3 months ago. From behind her kitchen window, she watched the Chen family's backyard with narrowed eyes, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The sight of smoke rising from their grill and the gathering crowd of guests seemed to agitate her more with each passing minute. Without any attempt to speak with the Chens directly, Mrs. Thompson decided to take matters into her own hands. She dialed the local police department, her voice trembling with what she claimed was concern. "There's excessive smoke coming from my neighbor's yard," she reported. "They're having some kind of large gathering. I'm worried about fire safety and noise ordinances." What Mrs. Thompson didn't know, what none of the newer neighbors knew, was that Mr. Chen had spent 25 years as the city's fire captain before his retirement. Every safety measure in place at his barbecues was meticulously planned, from the positioning of the grill to the fire extinguisher discreetly placed nearby. His years of service had made him more cautious than most about fire safety. As the first police car pulled up to the quiet street, the gathered guests fell silent. Mr. Chen's spatula paused mid-flip over the grill as he watched Officer Rodriguez step out of his vehicle. The officer's serious expression quickly melted into a broad smile as he recognized the man standing at the grill. "Captain Chen." Officer Rodriguez called out, walking toward the backyard. "I should have known when we got a call about a barbecue on Pine Grove that it would be you." The young officer had worked alongside Mr. Chen during his rookie years as a police officer, responding to various emergencies where their departments collaborated. The tension in the air dissipated as Officer Rodriguez explained the situation, and Mr. Chen's eyes darted toward Mrs. Thompson's house, understanding dawning on his face. He had tried several times to invite their new neighbor to their weekend gatherings, leaving friendly notes in her mailbox, but she had never responded. Mrs. Thompson, still watching from her window, saw the officer laughing and accepting a plate of grilled chicken from Mrs. Chen. Her confusion grew as more guests arrived, including other uniformed officers who appeared to be off-duty, all greeting Mr. Chen with obvious respect and familiarity. The story could have ended there, with a simple misunderstanding and an unnecessarily dispatched police officer. But what happened next would change the dynamics of Pine Grove forever, as Mrs. Thompson was about to discover something about her neighbor that would make her question everything she thought she knew about the quiet family next door. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, a fire truck pulled up to the street. This wasn't responding to an emergency, it was the annual tradition of Mr. Chen's old crew stopping by to celebrate with their former captain. The sight of firefighters in casual clothes, carrying dishes and greeting Mr. Chen with bear hugs, began to paint a very different picture of the man Mrs. Thompson had reported. Through her window, she watched as Mr. Chen demonstrated proper grilling techniques to a group of young firefighters, his movements precise and confident as he explained the importance of fire safety even in casual settings. She saw how the police officers and firefighters treated him with a mixture of respect and affection, like a beloved mentor rather than just another suburban retiree. The truth about her neighbor was spreading through the gathering crowd, reaching ears and inspiring stories about the legendary Captain Chen, who had saved countless lives during his career and trained a generation of firefighters. Mrs. Thompson stood frozen at her window, realizing that she had just reported one of the city's most respected fire safety experts for a supposed fire hazard. As the first part of this story draws to a close, Mrs. Thompson's embarrassment and regret began to bubble up, matching the heat from the grill that had caused such unnecessary concern. But this was just the beginning of a tale that would teach valuable lessons about judgment, community, and the importance of getting to know your neighbors before jumping to conclusions. Little did Mrs. Thompson know that her impulsive decision to call the police would set in motion a chain of events that would not only change her perspective but would also bring to light an incredible story of service, sacrifice, and the true meaning of community that had been quietly living next door all along. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to Mrs. Thompson's door. Her doorbell rang early on a Tuesday morning, and she opened it to find Mrs. Chen standing there with a warm container of homemade dumplings and a gentle smile. The aroma of ginger and scallions wafted through the air, making it impossible to refuse the peace offering. "I noticed you haven't been feeling comfortable with our gatherings," Mrs. Chen said softly, her kind eyes meeting Mrs. Thompson's embarrassed gaze. "I thought maybe we could talk over lunch." The invitation, delivered with such sincere warmth, caught Mrs. Thompson off guard. She had expected anger or resentment after her actions, not this gesture of friendship. As they sat at Mrs. Thompson's kitchen table, the story that unfolded over steaming cups of tea and delicate dumplings would change her perspective forever. Mrs. Chen shared tales of her husband's 25 years of service, but it wasn't just about fighting fires, it was about building a community. "Do you see that scar on his left hand?" Mrs. Chen asked, pointing through the window where Mr. Chen was tending to his garden. "He got that saving a young girl from an apartment fire 15 years ago. The building was collapsing, but he heard her crying and went back in." Her voice carried both pride and the lingering fear of those dangerous years. Mrs. Thompson learned that the weekly barbecues had started as a way to help first responders decompress after difficult shifts. It became a tradition where police officers, firefighters, and paramedics could find comfort in good food and friendly conversation. Over time, it expanded to include neighbors, creating a support network that stretched beyond professional boundaries. The conversation took an unexpected turn when Mrs. Chen revealed something that made Mrs. Thompson's heart sink. "You know, the smoke that bothered you last weekend? My husband is actually extra careful about that because of little Andy from 2 streets over. He has asthma, so we always check the wind direction and adjust the grill position to keep the smoke away from his house." As they talked, more layers of the Chen family's involvement in the community emerged. Their daughter volunteered at the local animal shelter. Their son helped elderly neighbors with yard work. Mr. Chen still conducted free fire safety workshops at schools and community centers, teaching children about emergency preparedness through engaging demonstrations and stories. Mrs. Thompson's eyes welled up with tears as she realized how quickly she had judged a family that had given so much to their community. "I feel terrible," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I've been so focused on protecting my perfect quiet life that I didn't even try to get to know you." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of sirens in the distance. Both women watched as Mr. Chen's phone rang almost immediately. Even in retirement, he remained connected to his former crew, offering guidance and support whenever needed. They observed as he spoke on the phone, his face serious and focused, jotting down notes and offering advice about the ongoing emergency. "He can't help it," Mrs. Chen explained with a fond smile. "Once a firefighter, always a firefighter. He says every call could be someone's worst day, and if he can help make it better, even from retirement, that's what he'll do." As the afternoon wore on, Mrs. Thompson began to understand that the weekly barbecues weren't just social gatherings, they were a testament to the bonds formed through years of service, sacrifice, and shared experiences. The smoke that had bothered her so much was actually a signal of something beautiful, a community coming together to support each other. The conversation between the two women laid the groundwork for something unexpected. Mrs. Thompson found herself sharing her own story, about moving to the neighborhood after her husband's passing, about her fears of starting over in a new place, and about how her anxiety had led her to withdraw from community life rather than embrace it. Mrs. Chen listened with the same empathy she had developed over years of supporting her husband through the emotional toll of his work. As the shadows lengthened and the afternoon light turned golden, she extended an invitation that would mark the beginning of a new chapter in Mrs. Thompson's life. "Next Sunday," she said, standing to leave, "why don't you join us? No pressure, just good food and better company. And you can see for yourself why my husband insists on manning the grill, though between you and me, I think he just likes wearing that silly apron." As Mrs. Chen left, Mrs. Thompson stood at her window, watching her neighbor walk home. But this time, instead of suspicion, she felt something else, hope. Hope that perhaps she had found not just neighbors, but a community where she could belong. Little did she know, the following Sunday would bring even more surprising revelations about the man she had so hastily judged. The days leading up to Sunday seemed to crawl by for Mrs. Thompson. She spent hours debating what dish to bring, finally settling on her grandmother's famous apple pie recipe, something she hadn't baked since her husband's passing 3 years ago. As she worked in her kitchen, rolling out the perfectly flaky crust, she could smell the familiar scents of the Chen family's preparations wafting through her window. This time, instead of drawing her curtains closed, she watched with interest as Mr. Chen meticulously cleaned his grill and arranged his cooking station. His attention to detail suddenly made sense. It wasn't just about cooking, it was about safety, about caring for others, about creating a space where people could relax without worry. When Sunday afternoon arrived, Mrs. Thompson found herself standing nervously at the Chen's back gate, clutching her pie. Before she could hesitate, a booming voice called out, "Come on in. You're just in time to see the master at work." Mr. Chen stood at his grill, wearing his signature apron and a welcoming smile that made her nervousness begin to melt away. As she integrated into the gathering, Mrs. Thompson noticed something she had missed from her window, the seamless way the Chens orchestrated these events. Every guest was welcomed like family, whether they were off-duty first responders, neighbors, or complete newcomers. Children played safely in designated areas, and there was always someone keeping a watchful eye on them. During the afternoon, Mrs. Thompson found herself seated next to an elderly gentleman who introduced himself as Dr. Li, a retired surgeon. As they talked, he shared a story that made her nearly drop her plate. "You see that group of firefighters over there with Chen?" he said, pointing to a cluster of young men hanging on Mr. Chen's every word. "He saved my grandson's entire kindergarten class 10 years ago." The story that followed left Mrs. Thompson speechless. There had been a major fire at a local elementary school, with one kindergarten class trapped on the second floor. Despite orders to wait for backup, Mr. Chen had led his team inside, using his knowledge of the building structure to find a safe path. He managed to guide 15 children and their teacher to safety, all while the building was threatening to collapse. "But here's what really tells you about the man," Dr. Li continued, his voice thick with emotion. "After everyone was safe, he visited every single one of those children in their homes, teaching them about fire safety and helping them process their fear. He turned a traumatic experience into a lesson in courage and preparedness." As the afternoon progressed, more stories emerged. Mrs. Thompson learned about the time Mr. Chen had organized a fundraiser for a family who lost everything in a house fire, or how he still volunteered at the fire department's youth program, mentoring teenagers interested in emergency services. Each story painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to not just saving people, but building a stronger, safer community. The sun was beginning to set when a commotion near the grill caught everyone's attention. A young woman had arrived with her family, and Mr. Chen's face lit up with recognition. As they hugged, Mrs. Thompson overheard snippets of their conversation. "This was one of the kindergartners from that school fire," now grown up and working as a paramedic herself, inspired by the man who had saved her life. The young woman's presence seemed to bring the day's events full circle. Here was living proof of how one person's dedication to service could ripple through generations, inspiring others to follow in their footsteps. Mrs. Thompson watched as Mr. Chen introduced the young paramedic to his newest trainees, her success story serving as inspiration for the next generation of first responders. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Thompson helped Mrs. Chen clean up, their movements falling into an easy rhythm. "You know," Mrs. Chen said softly, "he never talks about his achievements. For him, it's always been about the people, the lives touched, the communities built, the bridges formed between strangers who become family." Looking around at the diverse group of people still lingering in the backyard, firefighters, police officers, teachers, neighbors, all connected by the simple act of sharing a meal, Mrs. Thompson finally understood what these gatherings truly represented. They weren't just barbecues, they were a celebration of community, of service, of the bonds that form when people choose to open their hearts and homes to others. But as the night drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson had no idea that the most remarkable chapter of Mr. Chen's story was yet to be revealed, a secret that would explain why these weekly gatherings meant so much more than anyone realized. As autumn approached, the Sunday gatherings took on a cozier feel. Mr. Chen added a fire pit to his grilling station, creating a warm gathering spot where people could share stories as the evenings grew cooler. Mrs. Thompson had become a regular fixture at these events, often arriving early to help with preparations and staying late to hear the countless stories that seemed to flow as freely as the hot coffee and tea. One particularly crisp Sunday, she noticed something different about Mr. Chen. His usual cheerful demeanor seemed subdued, and he kept checking his phone more frequently than usual. Mrs. Chen caught her questioning glance and quietly pulled her aside near the herb garden. "Today's a difficult day," Mrs. Chen explained in hushed tones. "It's the anniversary of the Wellington Street fire." Her eyes drifted to her husband, who was absently adjusting the grill temperature. It was his last major fire before retirement, and the one that changed everything. Over the next hour, as they worked together preparing side dishes, Mrs. Chen shared the story that would help Mrs. Thompson understand the true depth of their Sunday traditions. The Wellington Street fire had been a massive apartment complex blaze, one of the worst the city had seen in decades. Mr. Chen, then fire captain, had led the response team. The building housed mainly elderly residents and young families, Mrs. Chen recalled, her hands pausing in their work. When they arrived, the situation was already critical. The fire had spread through multiple floors, and there were people trapped throughout the building. Despite the dangerous conditions, Mr. Chen and his team worked tirelessly to evacuate residents. As they cleared the upper floors, they heard crying coming from a smoke-filled apartment. Inside, they found a young mother unconscious near the door, with twin toddlers huddled in a bathtub filled with wet towels, exactly as fire safety instructions recommended. The mother had managed to protect her children but had been overcome by smoke while trying to find a way out. Mr. Chen carried the mother while his team rescued the twins. They barely made it out before the floor collapsed behind them. The mother survived, Mrs. Chen continued, her voice softening, but she had no family in the area, no support system. She was a single parent who had lost everything in the fire. She paused, watching as her husband demonstrated proper grilling techniques to some young firefighters. That's when these Sunday gatherings really began. Mr. Chen had organized the first community barbecue as a fundraiser for the displaced families from the Wellington Street fire. But it became something more when he realized how many people in their community were living without a support network. The weekly gatherings evolved into an informal safety net, where neighbors could connect, share resources, and look out for each other. As Mrs. Thompson absorbed this information, she noticed a young woman arrive with two identical boys, about 12 years old. Mr. Chen immediately stepped away from the grill, embracing all three of them with tears in his eyes. The realization hit Mrs. Thompson like a wave, these were the twins from the fire. The woman was Lisa, the mother they had rescued, and over the years, she had become like a daughter to the Chens. Her sons had grown up calling them Grandpa and Grandma, and the Sunday gatherings had become their extended family celebrations. After the fire, Mrs. Chen explained, we realized that safety isn't just about smoke detectors and fire escapes. It's about having people who notice when you're not there, who check on you during storms, who bring soup when you're sick. That's why these gatherings matter so much to him. The afternoon took on a deeper meaning as Mrs. Thompson watched Mr. Chen with the twins, teaching them how to check the meat's temperature and explaining why certain safety precautions were essential. She saw how he had transformed a traumatic event into a legacy of community building and support. But as the day progressed, Mrs. Thompson began to notice something else, subtle gestures and knowing looks between Mr. Chen and several of the regular attendees. It seemed there was yet another layer to these gatherings, another purpose that had remained hidden from view. The sun was setting when she overheard a whispered conversation that would lead her to discover the final piece of Mr. Chen's story, a secret mission that had been operating right under her nose every Sunday for years. This revelation would prove that these barbecues weren't just about community building, they were about saving lives in ways she never could have imagined. The revelation came on an ordinary Tuesday when Mrs. Thompson was tending to her front garden. She noticed an unfamiliar car pull up to the Chen's house, and a distressed-looking woman stepped out with two small children. Instead of going to the front door, they were quietly ushered around to the backyard, the same way Mrs. Thompson had seen several other families enter over the past few months. Her curiosity piqued when she saw Mr. Chen emerge from his garage carrying what looked like emergency supplies, blankets, bottled water, and a first aid kit. Something clicked in her mind, the whispered conversations at the barbecues, the occasional late-night visitors, the extra groceries Mrs. Chen always kept on hand. That evening, Mrs. Chen appeared at her door, knowing that her observant neighbor must have questions. Over cups of steaming tea, she revealed the full scope of their Sunday gatherings, and what happened during the rest of the week. The barbecues aren't just social events, Mrs. Chen explained softly. They're a cover for something bigger. We call it the Safe Haven Network. She went on to describe how Mr. Chen, even in retirement, had maintained connections with active first responders across the city. These connections helped identify families in crisis, victims of house fires, natural disasters, or other emergencies who needed immediate support. The Chen's home had become an unofficial halfway house for families in transition. The basement had been converted into a temporary living space, complete with basic necessities. The regular Sunday gatherings provided a perfect opportunity for these families to connect with community resources without drawing attention to their situations. Remember the Wellington Street fire? Mrs. Chen asked. Lisa and the twins weren't the only ones we helped. That experience showed us how many people fall through the cracks of official support systems. Sometimes, people need more than just emergency services, they need a bridge to get from crisis to stability. The network operated with quiet efficiency. The off-duty firefighters and police officers who attended the barbecues weren't just there for the food, they were part of an informal support system. Some offered legal advice, others helped with job searches or housing applications. The neighbors who regularly attended, without realizing it, were providing something equally valuable, a sense of normal community life for families in traumatic situations. Mrs. Thompson thought back to the various guests she'd seen at the barbecues, the woman with 3 children who stayed for several weeks, the elderly couple who appeared shortly after a storm had damaged their home, the teenager who seemed to show up every day after school. She had assumed they were all just part of the Chen's extensive social network. But why keep it secret? Mrs. Thompson asked, thinking of all the people who might benefit from knowing about this support system. Mrs. Chen's answer was simple but profound: dignity. The families we help are going through some of the worst moments of their lives. By making it look like just another neighborhood gathering, we give them a chance to rebuild without feeling like charity cases. The conversation was interrupted by a phone call. Mrs. Thompson watched as Mrs. Chen's face grew serious, and she began taking notes. Another family needed help, a father and 2 children displaced by an electrical fire. Without hesitation, Mrs. Chen began preparing the basement apartment, her movements practiced and efficient. As Mrs. Thompson helped her neighbor ready the space for its new occupants, she understood that she had stumbled upon something extraordinary. The Sunday barbecues weren't just about building community, they were a carefully orchestrated operation of compassion, a safety net for people who had lost everything. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. As they worked, Mrs. Chen shared one final detail about the Safe Haven Network, a revelation that would explain why Mr. Chen had chosen this particular neighborhood for his retirement, and why these weekly gatherings had become so crucial to their mission. This last piece of the puzzle would tie everything together, revealing a 20-year legacy of service that went far beyond fighting fires. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself on the 20th anniversary of the Chen family's move to Pine Grove. During a special Sunday gathering, Mr. Chen finally shared the story he had kept close to his heart all these years, the real reason he had chosen this particular neighborhood. As everyone gathered around the fire pit, their faces glowing in the warm light, Mr. Chen began his tale. Long before he became a firefighter, he and his family had been the ones in need of help. They had arrived in the country with nothing but dreams and determination, facing countless closed doors and suspicious looks. "We found ourselves in a shelter," Mr. Chen recalled, his voice thick with emotion. "No connections, no resources, just fear and uncertainty. But then we met a retired firefighter named Bill who lived in this very house." He gestured to his home, and Mrs. Thompson noticed several older guests nodding in recognition. Bill had taken the Chen family under his wing, offering them temporary shelter in his basement while helping Mr. Chen find work and learn English. That act of kindness had not only saved their family but had inspired Mr. Chen's entire career path. He had become a firefighter because of Bill, carrying forward the legacy of not just saving lives during emergencies, but helping rebuild them afterward. "When Bill passed away 15 years ago," Mr. Chen continued, "he left us this house with one condition, that we keep its doors open to those in need." The Sunday barbecues had started as a way to honor Bill's memory, but they had grown into something far more significant. Mrs. Thompson looked around at the gathered crowd with new understanding. The weekly gatherings weren't just about community or even about providing emergency shelter, they were about creating a sustainable cycle of hope and support. Every family who found refuge in the Chen's basement apartment was encouraged to return once they got back on their feet, to help others who were going through similar struggles. The Safe Haven Network had expanded far beyond Pine Grove. Other retired first responders had started similar programs in their neighborhoods, creating a web of support across the city. The Sunday barbecues served as informal training sessions, where those interested in starting their own safe havens could learn from Mr. Chen's experience. As the evening drew to a close, Mrs. Thompson watched a new family arrive, the father and children from the electrical fire. She saw how seamlessly they were welcomed into the gathering, offered plates of food and introduced to others without any mention of their circumstances. She understood now why her initial judgment of the smoke and noise had been so misplaced. What looked like a simple barbecue was actually a lifeline. "You know," Mr. Chen said, appearing beside her with a plate of his famous grilled vegetables, "when you called the police that day, you actually helped us. It reminded us that we needed to better communicate with our neighbors about what we do here." He smiled warmly. Sometimes the best partnerships start with a misunderstanding. Mrs. Thompson felt tears welling up in her eyes as she looked at the man she had once reported, a hero who had turned his own experience of hardship into a mission of hope. The smoke that had once bothered her now seemed like a signal beacon, calling out to those who needed help and those willing to provide it. In the months that followed, Mrs. Thompson became an integral part of the Safe Haven Network. Her spare room was added to the list of emergency housing options, and her legendary apple pies became a welcome tradition for new families. She learned that community isn't just about living next to each other, it's about showing up for one another, especially in the darkest moments. The story of the Chen family's Sunday barbecues continues to spread, not through grand announcements or public recognition, but through the quiet whispers of hope passed between those who need help and those who can provide it. And every Sunday, as smoke rises from Mr. Chen's grill, it carries with it the promise that no one in their community ever has to face their struggles alone. For in the end, the most powerful acts of heroism aren't always about rushing into burning buildings, sometimes they're about opening our doors, our hearts, and our communities to those who need them most. The end.